titled this Because Who He Is. And we want to take a look at, and we kind of do a survey of Matthew chapter 16 and a brief encounter that Jesus has with Peter and a question that he asked Peter. So let's take a look at this. This is going to be a two-part sermon. We'll get through the first part today, and then next week we'll do the rest of that. But the question that is asked of Peter is asked by Jesus here in Matthew chapter 16. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" And they replied, "Well, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Then Simon Peter answered, "You are Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by the Father in heaven." So this little comment, this little question that is asked by Jesus is a moment of both revelation and also a moment of unveiling for Jesus and for Peter as well in understanding. But the question for us is this: how does Jesus' question, the answer, and the understanding affect our life today? Then the other question along that, what does the way that Jesus answers tell us about Him? And the third question is, why the question in the first place? Why the question in the first place? Well, I would suggest here as we go, the first question that we find here in verse 13 is, who do people say that I am? Now, you say that's a question asked 2,000 years ago. However, that question is relevant for today because many people have questions about who Jesus is, and their answers are far more diverse than the answers that were given by the disciples as to who Jesus was. None of them said, for example, well, he's just another good man. They at least gave him, well, it could be John the Baptist, could be a prophet, could be Elijah, could have been all of these things. But in our world today, people say, well, Jesus is a fake. Jesus is this, or Jesus is that. So again, Jesus' identity was and still remains a mystery to most. When I say to most, we have to ask ourselves this question. Of all the billions of people on the face of the earth, how many know much about Jesus? And the question then is also for us, how much do you and I know about Jesus? What do we know about Him? So if Jesus would ask you or me this question, who do people say I am? The question we have to ask ourselves is, how would I respond to that question? Now, it's interesting that Jeanette had a list of things there that might be the way in which you would respond to the question. But would that be all that there would be in the way in which you or I might respond to the question? So let me give you some examples of reality in Jesus' day to this question, which also tie in with us today. What about the question of the virgin birth? The Messiah came as a baby. There were all kinds of questions as to who He is, who He was. If we don't think that there were no questions, then we have to recognize, for example, that Herod heard of the coming of the Messiah, but Herod and all of his consorts didn't know exactly who Jesus was. The shepherds would not have known who Jesus was were it not for the fact that God, through miraculous angels and all of that, told them who He was and go, this day a child is born. Mary and Joseph wouldn't have known nothing about Jesus, and they would certainly have some questions if God hadn't revealed, how this was all going to happen. Joseph would have certainly left Mary had it not been for God intervening through the angel. He would have left her. There's no question about it. I mean, he isn't the Father in that regard, so there'd be a lot of questions. And there, as we all know, there were questions that are recorded in the Bible about Jesus' authenticity or his birth. Well, we weren't born out of wedlock. We weren't born, as a bastard child. So there were questions we realize around that. We recognize that the religious leaders in Jesus' day had all kinds of questions about who he was, where he was born, where he came from. Well, you're from Nazareth. We know the child must come out of Bethlehem. All those things, which again, even today is a question and a comment and controversy in that regard. So when we look at the reality of who he is, there were questions in Jesus' day as exactly who he was. We recognize and understand that. And also we recognize that God intervened with Jesus, with Joseph and Mary, by telling them and giving them a name to call him. This is the name that you're going to call him. His name will be Emmanuel, God with us. His name will be called Jesus, because he came to save his people. Those are all things that were given to help identify, plus the miraculous birth and God's taking care of Joseph, Mary, and taking care of Jesus. We also recognize that Jesus' life was unacceptable. And again, if they had known who he was, his life would not have been unacceptable, but it was unacceptable. The way in which Jesus lived on this earth was unacceptable by the high priest, by the scribes, by the Pharisees. His way was also unacceptable by people, and at times his life was unacceptable by his own disciples, which says they didn't know who he was, or they would have accepted things differently. Now, in Scripture summation, I say summation because there are many Scriptures, but we're just going to look at a couple of Scriptures in response because who he is. In Scripture summation, this is what we have. We have, for example, and helping us to understand that they didn't understand, and we'll go to John chapter 1. In John chapter 1, and we'll begin here in verse 6. So when we look at Scriptures, we read what the apostles had to write about their knowing about who he was. But in John chapter 1, beginning here in verse 6, there came a man who was sent from God, whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all men might believe. Then he goes on to say, he himself was not the light, which of course we read earlier that they thought that he might be the one. He came only as a witness to the light. The true light that gives light to every man was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made by him, and we read that in the book of Colossians, that the whole world, everything in heaven and earth, was made by him. He has power over all things. He sustains and holds all things together. That's part of who he is. Part of who he is, but they did not understand. And as I was watching an interview between a couple of prominent people in our world today arguing the point about whether Jesus is real and religion and how that all interacts and what the world is like, there's argumentation about, well, we have this world, we have a universe, it's all this material, and somehow it just that's more important is the material, how all of that, without a recognizing or a recognition of God.
Feeling the blues today, or tired of life already? Do you have questions about life, or need spiritual advice? We can help. Log on to worldwidechurchofgod.com or wcgfairfield.blogspot.com and stay connected to reality. The Worldwide Church of God in Fairfield, Santa Rosa, and Modesto are located in the San Francisco Bay Area, regarded as the most prosperous region in the United States. We believe Jesus Christ when he proclaimed in Matthew 6:24 that serving God is more important than serving mammon. We welcome everyone to come and worship and fellowship every Saturday at the times listed on your screen and on our website, worldwidechurchofgod.com.